tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So we've been talking about craving, about the Four Noble Truths, about the metaphor of fire, or the simile of fire, burning. And this Friday at the book club, as I said, we'll be looking at the Brahmajala Sutta, the divine net, looking at 62 different kinds of wrong view. It's not as difficult as it seems, but it's a bit difficult. And last night at Spirit Walk, we talked about right view, and really as the basis of the path. And all of these topics, the Noble Truths and craving, turning toward right view as the basis for investigating the world, understanding our experience, understanding our lives. All of these point toward the core insights that the Buddha identified as the building blocks of why we are suffering. And when we find insight into these, this is really the turning point in practice, and the foundation for further inquiry. So, as you know, or probably know, in the Buddha's first discourse, the setting in motion of the wheel of the Dhamma, he spoke about the middle path between sensual indulgence and bodily mortification, and said that that middle path was the Four Noble Truths, which contain the Eightfold Path. Right? The Noble Truth of suffering or distress, dissatisfaction, the Noble Truth of the cause of that dissatisfaction being craving, kind of reactive clinging, the possibility, the truth of the cessation of that suffering or distress through the cessation of that craving, and then the Noble Eightfold Path as the discipline necessary to realize that cessation. And then the Eightfold Path itself, beginning with right view, beginning with how do we look at our experience in the world, right? And then flowing through intention, right? How our view begins to manifest toward action, toward our intent, our vows in the world, and then outward into speech, into physical actions, into our livelihood, and then turning inward into the effort, mindfulness, and immersion necessary to train the subtle energies of the body mind and to begin to heal the ancient patterns of trauma and constriction of the heart that follow us from lifetime to lifetime. And so while the Buddha was giving this first discourse, one of his 5 friends that he was giving the teaching to experienced the opening of the Dharma eye and exclaimed all things that have the conditions to arise, have the conditions to pass away. So this first insight, the Buddha gives a teaching really on dukkha, on suffering. And the first insight his friend has is the insight into impermanence. So these two are intimately connected. The Buddha says there's craving that leads to distress. And Kondanya, who's the friend, realizes that craving leads to distress partly because, or completely because pleasurable experiences can't be sustained because they're impermanent. Right? No matter what you do, you can't make safety or ease continue beyond the conditions that brought it into being. And you can't prevent pain and loss, because they too are brought into arising into being by conditions. And so the fact that it's craving that causes distress unfolds in the heart into the realization that the reason that we crave is that the heart can't bear or doesn't understand this impermanent nature of things. So dukkha, distress, and anicca, impermanence, are intimately tied together. Kondanya realizes this and becomes anya kondanya, which means kondanya who knows. And the Buddha says, Kondanya sees, Kondanya sees. I can only imagine how delighted he was, after all those years of practice. And he goes to teach his friends. And, one talk in, his friend says, I get it. And the Buddha is so pleased, So then they live together for some weeks practicing. And the Vinaya describes how they live together, and other sutras describe how they live together, one or two of them going for alms while the other ones meditated. The Buddha really teaches them this new meditation method that he's discovered. They had been practicing bodily mortification, and he rejects that as not working. And so he teaches them this new practice, which is jhana, that he realized and that led him to his awakening, right? After he realizes that the ascetic practices don't work, he wonders what might work, and he remembers this moment as a child under the rose apple tree, dropping into a peaceful, embodied samadhi, first jhana, experiencing the bliss or the rapture of the senses being at rest, the rapture of seclusion, the bliss of seclusion. And he realizes that this is the mind state that actually is helpful, not the disembodied states of nothingness and radical shutting down that he had learned from his first teachers, and not the bodily punishment, the self-harm really, that he had tried in his ascetic path, but an almost childishly simple, since he realizes it as a child, practice of resting into the pleasure of just being still and at ease. And I don't think we can overstate how radical this is. This was not actually a practice present in the culture around him, right? Ascetic practice was what was popular. And when he first goes to his friends to say, hey, I found a new way, they initially reject him because he's gone soft, but he convinces them and he gives them this teaching. And then as they practice together and they learn this new meditation, when he understands that they're ready for the next insight, really, so it just takes a handful of days practicing in this way. When they are ready for it, he gives his famous second teaching, which is the teaching on the characteristic of not self, or anatta. So this completes, in these first two talks, really the exposition of these three marks or characteristics, the tilakkhana. Lakkhana means mark or characteristic. T is three. So the tilakkhana, anicca, dukkha, and anatta, impermanence, suffering or distress or dissatisfaction, and selflessness, comprise the core insights that are the doorway to this new way of understanding experience that the Buddha is bringing forward. And he comes back to anatta again and again throughout his teaching career. It's central to everything that he brings forward, because it deconstructs what is probably the core craving that keeps us on the wheel of rebirth. And it's really the craving or the attachment to existence, the attachment to being, to becoming, to birth. Right? And you see this clearly in the sequence of dependent origination, where sensory contact unfolds into feeling, feeling unfolds when not seen with mindfulness, into craving, craving into the calcified actions of clinging, clinging into the reified identity, uh, really the attachment to being itself, to being any kind of identity. And then being or existence, and the craving that has led to further being and existence then unfolding as birth, right? Unfolding as further birth or further rebirth. And birth always leads to aging and death. And the cycle goes around and around. So selflessness then is at the core of the teachings on rebirth. It's at the core of the teaching on karma, karma in Sanskrit. Karma is the word for action. And the Buddha's teaching on action is that karma, which is the force that gives rise to future experiences, karma is generated by intention and really brought into motion through our actions. And there's the realization that action always bears fruit, right? Our actions have impacts. And, selflessness in this strange way is tied in with karma because the core illusion, in a way, like the mistake that we make over and over, is to think that I'm the one doing this action, that there's a kind of separate, individual personality. I'm the one doing this. And and there's this, like, it feels so real that I'm not a part of the system that my actions are reverberating through. Right? The sense of being an individual actor, in a way, is that in a certain way I'm outside the system. And this is a very ancient idea in most cultures. Certainly in European religious cultures of various kinds, that many of us have ancestry in the Judeo-Christian Islamic cultures. The sense of being an individual with a certain kind of will, and that will acts and is in relationship to the judgment of the divine and the laws of right and wrong action. And that self is the one that is judged and rewarded or punished, based on our actions. It's so close to the teaching on karma, but not quite the same in this fundamental way. That what karma teaches us is that our self and everything that we do is not outside of the system acting on it, like we can reach in and sort of move things around on the game board, but actually that we are completely immersed in it. Right? And so it throws into doubt, or into a kind of complexity, the intuition that we have around what it means to have individual will, what it means to make a choice. What does it mean to make a choice to do something or another? Because karma teaches us that we are inseparable from the ecosystem of conditions in which we move. And so then we are moved by conditions, right? Where does the intention that I have to do a certain thing, where does that come from? If I trace it back even through my psychology in this life, I can see the seeds of it in all these places. In so many ways, therapeutic healing, is a way of investigating the process of karma in this life. How did the actions of my parents, for instance, affect me when I was very young in my developmental process? And how are those experiences the seeds of feelings and intentions and worldviews that I'm having now, some of which are distressing, are suffering? Or what am I craving or clinging to that can be traced to, actions in the past? What anatta asks us to do, and this is very not intuitive, is to open ourselves to what this experience of being in relationship with others in the world and making choices and acting, being involved, being immersed in the world, to really ask, what's it like to do all of that, to experience all of that, but without assuming, kind of as an unconscious belief at the heart of it, that there's a separate individual here? What if everything is the same? All the relationships are the way they are, difficult people are the way they are, you have to figure out how to be in the world in wise, well-boundaried, skillfully maneuvered relationship. All of that is true. What happens if we take out of that mix the assumption that there's an individual here driving a separate vehicle called your body through the world? What if we take away that sense of separation? And it's more like there's a consciousness arising here in the middle of a radically interpenetrated ecosystemic web. And this consciousness is usually aware of just this small part of the web, but in meditation can open to be aware of more parts of the web, even all of it in the kind of mind that a Buddha knows. What if that's how it is? And there's nothing here that can be identified as the seat of separateness. So the term self or selflessness or not self or no self, as we've said many times, is a poor translation of the Pali word atta or the Sanskrit word atman. Probably a better translation for it is soul or essence or substance. Essence and substance are kind of the old religious and philosophical terms in European discourse for the idea that there's a singular, unique, permanent, which means immortal, essence to a person that lasts beyond the body. And, the medieval Christian, theologists really wrestled with this, right? Like, does the soul come into being at the moment of conception, or is the soul latent in the universe until the body appears that it attaches to? And then after the body dies, does it just continue on forever? Like, to have the conception of us having an individual permanent essence was difficult for the fairly literally minded medieval theologians to figure out. So, mercy to them. Hard task to fit direct experience, where we feel like individuals, in with a theology that understands, something like a soul to be immortal. It was a hard puzzle. And as I read medieval, Christian philosophy and theology, not just Christian, but like Islamic and uh, Jewish as well. Um, all of these theologies have to wrestle with at some point what it might mean or must mean to be immortal, to have an immortal soul or essence, an individual essence. And there's lots of different ideas in those traditions about what that is, how literal it is, how symbolic it is, what its relationship is to various conceptions of the divine. The Buddha, um, bless his pragmatic approach, um, completely avoids the minefield of trying to figure out what this is, completely avoids the problem of speculative metaphysics, which is what all of that really is, right? The reason it's a puzzle is that you're trying to find a logical, you know, uh, coherence between ideas that are difficult to cohere, you know, the idea of an omnipotent God, the idea of an eternal soul with the perception of a changing world and, you know, and an obviously impermanent body. What do you do with all that? And the Buddha's approach was to uh, reject the whole line of questioning that said, you know, how do I make a coherent theory around this intuition that there's a permanent soul and the idea that there's, you know, like a sentient, personally relatable divinity out there who created it all, including the souls? What's our relationship to them? All of that. The Buddha rejected those questions as being essentially, you know, off topic. And he wouldn't answer them. So he didn't actually say there is no soul. Neither would he say there is a soul. He would say it's the wrong question. The thing that you can do with this idea of a soul is you can look for it. And the Buddha is relentlessly what we would call phenomenological. He looks for direct experience of something. And if you can't directly experience it, including in very deep meditation, as he has done, then he doesn't proclaim it as a theory. You know, there's nothing in the discourses where he says, you know, I think this is true either logically or mystically, and you should just believe me, even though you can never have a direct experience of it. Everything he proclaims, including, you know, full liberation itself, the existence of heaven realms, the workings of karma, all of that uh, the tradition proposes can be directly experienced for yourself. This is a deeply empowering tradition. You have to do the work to cultivate the mind states that can experience it. But there's nothing in the tradition that you have to take on faith, including all of this stuff about the soul. So when the Buddha comes to his friends and he says, okay, I'm going to talk to you about this, this intuition we have of a permanent soul or essence, the way he goes about it is he uses the list of the aggregates, form, feelings, perceptions, formations, consciousness, and he inquires of each of them, could this be this permanent essence? And for something to be a permanent essence, it would be coherent or reasonable, it would make sense to call it I, or me, or mine, or myself, right? So is this body me? So he starts with form. Can the body be called me? Or can it be called my possession? Like maybe I'm a sort of soul and I own the body? Or maybe the soul is in the body? Or the soul controls the body? All of those things. Is there anything in the body that can be called my soul or myself or my possession? Right? So you can do I, me, mine as a abbreviation for that. And the way the Buddha investigates this is he says, form is not self. So form itself, like the body, it can't be this thing that we want to call a self or a soul. And his argument is like this. If form were self, now this is directly from the discourse now. This is Samyutta Nikaya 2259, the characteristic of not self. It's the Buddha's second discourse. If form were self or soul, it wouldn't lead to affliction, right, or pain or distress. And you could compel form. May my form be like this, may it not be like that. But because form is not self, it leads to affliction, and you can't compel form. May it be like this, may it not be like that. And then the same for all of the aggregates, feeling, perceptions, formations or choices, and consciousness. And so one of the core insights here is that if something were my possession, the definition of something being my possession is that I can control it, right? I own this phone or this computer or these shoes, whatever it is, and so I can take them where I want. And if somebody takes it without my permission, I have some legal right to be like, that's mine, please give it back. Ownership is defined by agency, right? You can compel it to be a certain way. So this is a great deconstruction that the Buddha gives, because you might think that your body is yours, but by this logic, how much can you really compel your body? May it be like this, may it not be like that, Over the weekend, we did an enormous hike on a backpacking trip. And it would be great if I could compel my calves to not be sore, but they are. And so are they mine? Like, do I really own them if I can't make them be the way I want? And,
You're going up? Oh,
you
okay, I'm going now.
and so, in all of these ways, form can't be the soul. So it's not mine. I can't control it. It leads to affliction. I suffer over it. It leads to pain. It does things I don't want. It hurts sometimes. Of course, it's aging. It will die. And central to this is its impermanence, of course, right? The body is impermanent. So how could it be my permanent soul or my permanent possession? So it can't be. And so then the Buddha dismisses it on those grounds. So this is how it begins. First, if any of the aggregates were a self or a soul, they wouldn't lead to affliction. They wouldn't lead to distress. How could something that was permanent be distressing? This one's a little harder to wrap yourself around, but permanent philosophically here means unchanging, right? So is there an essential nature to you or to anything, to any object, to any experience that can be said to be permanent and unchanging, for all conceivable time? And if it were absolutely unchanging, how could it be involved in my experience, right? Like right at this moment, I'm happy, but 12 hours ago, I was actually a little stressed about something, and so when I woke up this morning, and so is that permanent, unchanging soul not connected to my changing mood, where there was some suffering and now there's not? If the permanent soul were connected to those moods, it would be a changeable thing, and therefore it wouldn't be permanent and unchanging. And if it's not connected to those things, then what is it? What's its relationship to changing experience, right? So if any of these things, including consciousness, right? You could say, okay, the body is changing, but what about consciousness? Could consciousness be the soul? And if it were that, you know, when there's consciousness of something, right? I'm conscious of what I'm seeing. I'm conscious of what I'm feeling, hearing, doing, tasting, etc. Consciousness is changing because consciousness arises with the objects that it connects with. As I see you, consciousness of seeing you arises. And the Buddha says there's not a consciousness or an awareness that's beyond, that is, permanent there, that's observing things that are changing, right? There's not a witness position separate from everything, neutrally observing and not connected. He said you can't find that. All you can find is the consciousness of experiences arising. And then you fall asleep and that consciousness disappears for a while. It's changing. And because it's changing, it can't be your soul. And so that's true for all of the aggregates, for all of these aspects. So he starts with, if it were permanent, if it were a permanent soul, it wouldn't lead to affliction and you could control it. Then he goes on, is form, and again, for all the aggregates, is it permanent or impermanent? His friends say it's impermanent, clearly. If it's impermanent, is it suffering or happiness, right? And here, maybe suffering and happiness aren't perfect terms. What they're pointing to is, is it satisfying or unsatisfying? Where satisfying means reliable, right? Reliably satisfying. Is your body reliably satisfying? Come on, like sometimes it's satisfying, but that's not what we're looking for, right? The Buddha is not satisfied with, sometimes if conditions are right, if the weather is right and it's not too hot and not too cold and not too buggy and not too moist, and I'm not too old and not too young and not too sick, but it's not that way. In the chat, Karen says, every time you talk about this, I think of the song Heaven by the Talking Heads. So we can put that on our Sangha playlist. Go and listen to that. So, okay, if it's impermanent, it can't be permanently satisfying. Therefore, it's dukkha. And but if it's impermanent, suffering, and perishable, is it fit to be regarded thus? This is mine. I am this. This is myself. They say no, and true for all of the aggregates. So then the Buddha says, so you should truly see any kind of form at all, and again, for all the aggregates, past, future, or present. So that means thinking about it in the past, anticipating it in the future, experiencing it directly in the present, internal or external, that's in yourself or someone else or in the world, solid or subtle, inferior or superior. Those all deal with ways that we might perceive the world, including in deep meditation. Far or near, all form with right understanding or right view. This is not mine, I am not this is not myself. Seeing this, a learned, noble disciple grows disillusioned with form, feeling, perceptions, formations, and consciousness. Being disillusioned, desire fades away or craving fades away. When craving fades away, they're freed. When they're freed, they know they're freed. They understand rebirth is ended, the spiritual journey has been completed, what had to be done has been done. There is nothing further for this place, or there will be no more rebirth into the round of suffering. That's what the Buddha said. And while this discourse was being spoken, the minds of the group of five were freed from defilements by not grasping. So with this discourse, this not self discourse, all five of the Buddha's friends awoke fully and were free. So the sequence then is, to really explore, not philosophically the idea of the soul, but to go from direct experience. Things are changing, things hurt. Is there anything here that I can fundamentally rely on as being mine, as being me? And you can't find anything. Seeing that, you become disillusioned with it, not with hatred, not with pushing away, not with disembodied kind of rejection or aversion, but you lose the instinct to grasp at that which cannot provide lasting satisfaction. And I think a little bit about the way that I grew out of liking sugar. When I was a teenager, I super overdosed on ice cream. I thought ice cream was sort of my only refuge. I wasn't very happy, but I ate a lot of ice cream. And at one point when I was like 16 or 17, I remember it being about 12:30 in the middle of the night. I was watching Doctor Who on PBS, on the local PBS station running BBC reruns. And I was eating ice cream, and I realized that I was eating ice cream for the fourth time that day. That I had ice cream after breakfast, and at school, kind of for lunch, and after school as an after-school snack and a milkshake, and then after dinner, maybe it was like the fifth. I mean, it wasn't after breakfast. There's four of those, and then I was having it again as a midnight snack, and I just realized that it absolutely wasn't making me happy, and that there was no way that ice cream could make me happy, and that the happiness that came from ice cream was so temporary that it was actually kind of almost not worth it. And then it was just not worth it. And I just stopped. And I lost the craving for sugar. And um, and going through my adult life without much of a craving for sugar, has been so freeing, right? And it's like this anytime we snap out of an old addictive pattern. And what the Buddha is saying is that becoming disillusioned with the aggregates, disillusioned with, sensory experience, because we've seen through any idea, all those ancient ideas that we carry around, that we inherit from everyone, from our cultures, and our ancestors, the idea that the right relationship will make us happy, that the right, rituals will make us happy, that the right relationship to God will make us happy, that enough money will make us happy, that a healthy enough body will make us happy, that really good sex will make us happy, that a better government would make us happy. I'll take it. I'll take all of that, really. Like, don't get me wrong. But to be in the illusion that those things will provide permanent, reliable security, um, is something to wake up to. And so when we wake up to that, that's the disillusionment. And when you become disillusioned with something, not by trying to be disillusioned with it, but just by seeing it for what it is, uh, the desire for it fades away. Right? And when you're freed, you know you're freed. And so we move from I, me, and mine to something else, right? We fall away from the individual I, and we move into what, I think we move from I'm experiencing this, to something more neutral, that's more like this is arising. It's not disembodied, but it's not possessive. Oh, this is arising. Sensation is arising. Feeling is arising. Fondness for my friend is arising. Love is arising. Grief is arising. For me, certainly we open to a much more interconnected kind of we. But even we can feel like I just have a lot of allies, other individuals that I'm hooking in with as a kind of web. Me to we, I think, is a really good step. But it's almost more like, from the idea of me, the individual mushroom, to like, it's not even we, it's more like from the mushroom to the mycelium, it's not even a we, it's just a vast interconnected web of aliveness and communication and energy, you know. And from mind, from the possessive mind, not quite into ours. Again, that's a sort of collective socialist goodness. It's a step in the right direction, but it's more like, nobody's. Nobody owns the forest. Nobody owns the mycelium. Even the mycelium doesn't own itself. It's more like the mycelia and the trees and the fog and, and the visiting thrush and the banana slugs and everything, every bit of bacteria, and leaf fall is as much the heart of the organism as anything else. There's no heart of the organism, actually. There's no self to the forest, and it's just an ancient, uh, very, very painful and earth-destroying mistake that the humans made to see themselves as separate from the world they lived in, the masters of it who held it under dominion and controlled it, or tried to, even though we can't really. So I think we are asked to grow through radical disillusionment from I, me, and mine into this and we and nobodies, really. And this is the insight into anatta. And this is why in the later tradition, this would bloom into the radical, interconnectedness that the Mahayana really, leans on. Everything a part of everything else. I'm pausing there. Thank you.